Hi, everybody. Good evening and welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today's Monday, March 13th, 2023. After a week off, I'm really glad to be back. Excited to be doing this again. Missed talking with you guys. So tonight's forum, we do something at Evoke on our Finding You broadcasts where one broadcast is on a topic and then the next one is a question and answer. You can always submit questions, answers, suggestions, any ask that you'd like to via email at webinar@evoketherapy.com. Any questions that have come in prior to the broadcast will be prioritized in the order that they're received. If you want to submit a live question during the broadcast tonight for live audience members, please submit them at any time. And Sarah, who's moderating this evening for me, will present those to me in the order that they're received when there's time in the broadcast. Before I jump into the first question, I just want to share again the masterclass that I'm going to be teaching. I spent last week on a vacation writing, actually. I wrote about two-thirds of at least the first draft of my new book on attachment theory. And it was really good preparation for the masterclass that I'm going to be teaching on May 26th from 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. This is a class about attachment-based therapy. It's for therapists, people that work with anyone in a therapeutic context. If you're a parent or not a therapist or don't work in a clinical context, I've been asked this several times. Can you attend? The answer is, of course, you can attend. The only qualification that I'll make prior to this is that if you're a parent and you're not a clinical, it's not your career, I'm not going to talk about parenting per se or speak to it directly. There's tons to extrapolate from therapy to parenting and from parenting to therapy, but you'll have to do that yourself. So the class goes from 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Mountain Time with an hour for lunch. It's $250, and that affords you 6 continuing education credits. If you want to learn more about it, contact professionals at evoketherapy.com or webinar@evoketherapy.com, and you can register there. So I'm really excited to be teaching it. All right, let's get into the questions that have been pre-submitted. I'll start with the first one. Looks like it has some length to it. Part 1. My son, 14, is suddenly really out of line, getting in trouble at school. Several years, it looks like. Reached out this week. Bullying a girl who turned his advances down, being threatening to his sister, leaving the house in the middle of the night because he's bored, stealing money from us, constantly lying. The behavior is impulsive, and he does have ADHD and appears to be taking his meds, but isn't acting like it. He gets dysregulated and doesn't take the time to calm down. His dad teaches at the school and is dreading going to work because every day our son is disrupting a friend's class or being rude to our friends. Part 2. We've set reasonable expectations, consequences, and have a loving relationship with him and talk about the choices he's making. His consequences are losing privileges until he makes amends for his behaviors in ways that are acceptable to the people he disrespected. I'm adding in a walk with him at night a couple of times a week when I can handle it. That's when he's most open to talk. We were close before this behavior stopped, so I'm disappointed, frustrated, sad that I've been pulling away. Do you have any thoughts or advice? First of all, always when I get questions like any questions where people are talking about these kinds of difficulties, I just want to say I'm sorry. This sounds really, really hard and not an easy solve. It sounds like you have a pretty reasonable approach, even methodical approach to dealing with them. I don't know what kind of therapy he's had prior to this. It doesn't sound like necessarily you're an Evoke family, but maybe somebody that just listens to the podcasts. So with that, my first thoughts are going to get an assessment. What is going on? That kind of behavior that doesn't seem to you can't make an obvious connection to the behaviors and what might be disturbing him, what might be upsetting him. If there is a possibility for psychological testing, if that's available to you, that's something I would invite. I've talked about it before, how I'm lukewarm. I'm ambivalent about forcing adolescents to go to outpatient therapy. That is individual outpatient therapy. But I think going to family therapy could be helpful. Maybe the family therapist can find a way in. When I take a family into family therapy, this is actually really good to speak to, because it doesn't just it's not just about family therapy in general, but even family therapy with our intensive program. One of the things I say to the parents at the outset, at the point of registration or enrollment, is I'm going to put you on the hot seat first. I'm not going to be critical, but I'm going to ask you the difficult questions, ask you to look at and explore yourself first. So just wanted to share that with you, because you have to be ready to be on the hot seat. The question becomes, is why is he acting out? Is it chemical? Is it something like you said, with a learning disability or a learning difference? Sometimes these kinds of antisocial behaviors are cover up for ADHD or other learning differences. There's a lot of research that suggests that oppositional behavior, the more severe form, which is called an adolescence conduct disorder, is often correlated with learning differences. And for those kinds of kids, it's just better to be the bad kid than to be the dumb kid in their minds. Now, we know that they're not the dumb kid, but that's the way that they think about it. So it's kind of like being the class clown, only instead of that, he's being the class bully. But I would get really, really, really curious about what's going on beneath the surface. I mean, that's always the question in my approach, my mindset, Evoke's approach, is why is it happening? What's underneath? One of my favorite quotes of all time, I haven't quoted it probably in a couple of years on this broadcast, at least a year, is a quote from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, that says, "If we read the secret history of our enemies, we find in each man's story, suffering sufficient to disarm all hostility." I'm going to say that again because I kind of butchered it. If we read the secret history of our enemies, we find in each man's story suffering sufficient to disarm all hostility. So what he's saying, and what attachment theory in the Evoke approach tells us, is that there's something underneath it, some wound, some trauma that is being expressed in these ways. So aside from the external things that you're doing, the approaches that you're talking about, where you're talking to him, where you're giving him, it sounds like, reasonable, not reactive consequences, asking for reparative behavior on his part before the consequences are lifted. All of that sounds great, but I would try to find a way in to see if there's some way to find out where the anger and the rage is coming from. One of my favorite quotes actually isn't talking in this context. I believe it's a Dr. Martin Luther King quote that says, "Violence is the angry of the unheard." That's the full quote. That we think that rebellion is a kind of final effort for the psyche to express itself when all else fails. So maybe most difficultly, perhaps why I went to the part of the very beginning of answering this question about putting you on the hot seat first, is the anger could be directed at you and your husband. It might not make sense to you at all, but that's where I would look. That's where I would be curious about. So I don't have any other specific approach except for find a way in, either through testing, through individual therapy, if he's willing to go, through family therapy, even if the family therapist is just going to provide you their perspective. One of the great paradoxes of parenting kids that struggle with these kinds of issues, with mental health issues, is that parents will often say, and it's true in some ways, that they're as close to their children as anybody, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have the ability to see them the most clearly. So I would try to find a way in, to find an explanation. When I teach therapists, when I'm training therapists, I say to them, find a story that explains the behavior. Find a story where all the behavior that you're seeing makes sense, and there is a story. Now, it might be neurological, meaning it might not be simply contextual, but it might be organic and like I said, chemical. But there also could be some contextual environmental pieces that are contributing to it. And like I said, it could be something as simple as a learning difference that he's ashamed, feels so inadequate displaying, and that he wants to um, act it out to distract everybody from being discovered. And maybe even act out in a kind of a bullying and cruel way that gives him a sense of power, of control over other people. And so, where he might feel small, insecure, less than, being a bully makes one feel more powerful. It gets other people to feel the same way that you're feeling. I can remember when I heard a story about my son bullying a neighbor boy, younger than him, smaller than him, even with some developmental delays. And I said to my son in anger when I found out and he came home, I said in anger, does it make you feel good? Does it make you feel big to pick on people that are smaller than you? And he was scared because I was very loud, very angry. I was embarrassed, a lot of emotions that I needed to process, frankly, that I hadn't processed, that I was taking out on him. And shaking fear in response to me, he simply said, yes, it does. And then I got more angry because I wasn't regulated. But the point is that's what that behavior often serves. So finding out the explanation and starting to treat the root, trying to speak to and heal and repair the root instead of the weed that we see growing above the surface would be my biggest suggestion. And because it sounds like on the surface, on the behavioral level, you're doing all the right things, and maybe even your talks will yield some fruit in that area too. But that's a difficult one. The only thing I'll add to this before I move on to the next question is, parents, this is for all of you, and I can't underscore this enough. I can't emphasize this enough. Make sure you're getting your own support, your own therapy, not because you're the cause of the problem. I think that's the old thinking, but because you need support. Parenting parenting is impossibly hard, even when it's easy. Because when it's easy, oftentimes the child is being the good child. My daughter said just the other night, I think I've shared with you a few times, she said, I'm the only one of my friends, she's 15, she said, I'm the only one of my friends who knows that everybody has some trauma. And even if I were to leave this family, our family, with the complaints that I have about it and go to another family, I would find other complaints, other traumas, other wounds there. So find the trauma, find the story where it makes sense. And for you as a parent, make sure that you're getting support, because you need to vent. You need to take care of yourself outside of the parent-child relationship. I haven't said this clearly, I don't think ever, but I'm going to say it right now. The parent-child relationship doesn't serve, it's not designed to take care of the parent. That's as simple and clear as I can explain a basic tenet of attachment theory and treatment. The parent-child relationship doesn't take care of the parent's needs. The parent has to take care of their own needs somewhere else, by and large, so that when they show up to the relationship with the child, to a dialogue, a discussion, a decision with the child, like the ones that you're having to make about his behaviors, the parent can be there for the child because they've taken care of themselves in other places. So, above and beyond, to all the parents listening and watching tonight, make sure you have a solid self-care regiment and routine. Because if you don't, you will more than likely dent your child in more significant ways than you would otherwise. I mean, we all make mistakes. We're all human. We all dent our children. But if you're not taking care of yourself, you will leak out your emotions and your needs onto the child, and the child will feel angry or obligated to fulfill them. And no matter what the response is, it's taxing on the child's psyche. So make sure you're taking care of yourself. That's always my answer with these work, or always part of my answer, I should say. Somebody writes, as I'm reading The Journey of the Heroic Parent, I am realizing so many mistakes that I did in my parenting. Should I let my son know about these? How to do that in a way that shows that I take responsibility without taking agency away from my 17-year-old on taking responsibility where he should? Keep that. That's a great question. It is okay to make an amends, both generally or of course in the moment, day to day with your children. Let me give a couple of caveats to that. Not so that you are forgiven. I know that sounds strange, maybe, but you don't make amends to be forgiven. You make amends, you make your apology as a gift that you give freely, expecting, as the word gift denotes, at least in family systems theory, it means something that's a one-way exchange. It's not a contract. It's not a payment or something that you give quid pro quo in exchange for something else. A gift is something you give. And many children will brush it off. They'll dismiss it. They'll say it's no big deal, maybe because it feels too intimate to them. Maybe because it will, if they really accept the gift, it will expose the pain that they felt. And that's very difficult, and they're going to be defended about that. But also because they'll feel responsible for taking care of you. So you kind of have to make sure that when you're ready to make an amends, that you're doing it as a gift, giving freely, that you don't need anything back, that you can kind of expect them to say, no big deal, don't worry about it, whatever, blow you off, dismiss it. But I still like it. I still like it. I think it's one of the most important things that we can do. And you don't have, I mean, part of the way that you take accountability without taking over his accountability is you make sure to language very carefully what you did in the journey of the heroic parent. If you've gotten to that part yet, I actually quote a small story from the Anatomy of Peace, where two parents, after spending a day dropping off their child in a wilderness therapy program, sit at a parent workshop, and they're talking at the end of the day, and the wife says to the husband, as I think they're walking into the hotel room, she says, I feel so badly for all the things I've done to our son, Christopher, I think his name is. And the father, feeling defensive and also wanting to guard against what you're wanting to guard against, says to the mother, you didn't put the drugs in Chris's mouth. That's not your responsibility. And in this telling of the story, the wife turns to the husband very clearly and says, you misunderstood me. I'm not sorry for what he did. I'm sorry for what I did. So you take responsibility for what you did, not for what they did, not for how they responded. You can acknowledge how they felt, but it's not even really taking responsibility for their feelings. It's taking responsibility for the act. We used to have a letter that we went away from 6 or 7 years ago. I should have done it many years before, but I lacked the courage, to be honest with you. I was just doing what I had been taught. And there are things like that in my past, not just as a parent, but as a clinician. It was called the Impact Letter. And what I didn't like about the Impact Letter, why we went away from it about 6 or 7 years ago was, or 8 years ago, it suggested by its title that the letter was about, it was written to the child about, let me tell you of the impact you've had on other people. And to me, it was inherently shaming. It was intrinsically suggesting that the child is responsible for everybody else's feelings around them. And that goes completely contrary to what I know about child development, what we know about child development, what attachment theory teaches us, okay? I had a parent, and I've had more than one say that they've done a version of this, but I had a parent send to me their 9 years later or so, I think it might have been 7 or 8 or 9, 9 years later, their apology letter for the Impact Letter. And the thing I wanted to point out to you is they didn't go through and apologize for what the child did. They apologized for what they did, how they approached the child. And it was beautiful. And one of the questions that I showed it to a colleague that I was sitting with while I was reading it, And one of the things they said is, "Isn't the child gonna use that against the parent?" And I said, "It's impossible. If you write it with the right intent, which is a gift that you give freely, they can't use it against you because you're not expecting or needing anything back." That whole idea, I think that you have in your question, you're not alone. It is a very common idea, and it comes from growing up in a family where it's about competition and who's the most right, who's the most wrong. This is not a zero-sum game. This is not if somebody wins and somebody loses and it all adds up to 0 all the time. This is in families, if somebody wins, everybody wins. And if one person loses, especially if it's the parent, well, if it's the child too, everybody loses. So it's something that you give from your heart. I love it. I think it's probably yeah, of the things that I teach, I could teach it more. A lot of times when I'm doing an inquiry call with somebody considering our program, and I think they might not be ready or might not even be at the point where our program is appropriate, I'll often say to the parent before I hang up the phone call, the inquiry phone call, I'll say to them, if you want something to take away, go back to your child and apologize for something you've done. Or sometimes I say to parents, tell them that you talked to a family therapist, me. Tell them that you talked to the family therapist about all the problems you were concerned about the child. And I kind of read you the riot act and told you that there was some of your participation in this issue, also. Find a way to show and model for them vulnerability. The best way, and I'll end with this, the best way that I know to teach children accountability is to model it. But most parents are afraid because of the power struggle, the power dynamic that they grew up with and that they've raised their children with, which I have too. I was raised with it, and I did too. That it goes against my training. It goes against my wiring and my background. But when I can do it, and I can do it from a place of wholeness and healing, not of guilt and of shame or needing to be forgiven, needing for them to forgive me, don't do it for those reasons. Because that's for you. That's your ego need. If anything, they need to forgive and move on for themselves, not for you. But if I do it from the quote unquote right place, it's a pure joy. And I don't care how they respond. And they often brush it off or make light of it, but that's okay. It gets in there and it shows them. Then they start to learn that they can do that too and that they're not compromised. It's one of the most heroic things that parents can do. So thanks for asking. I'm glad you asked. Somebody writes, what does it mean to do your work? Well, I'm only going to give you a glimpse of this because I'm going to write that's actually one of our upcoming broadcasts. In fact, I'll turn to that slide for the live viewers. I'm doing a broadcast on what is the work and how do you do it on March 30th. So I'll go in more depth then, but I'll tell you, the work is to know yourself. I'm going to list a few things. To know yourself, to know and to see clearly where you came from, your context. Because your context was not the truth. It was one of an infinite number of possibilities. Meaning what your parents thought, what your family did wasn't the right way. It was just your family's way. And that there is so much to unpack when we look at our background, when we look at how we were conditioned, how we were taught, the roles that we were enrolled in, the rules, not the conscious rules, but the unconscious rules. Freud calls them unconscious obligations. Those are the shoulds and the shouldn'ts. It's learning to get rid of the shoulds and the shouldn'ts. It's learning to do battle with shame, not just shame, but guilt. It's becoming who you are. And becoming who you are, as my daughter announced to a group that we were co-teaching at a year and a half ago in New York. breaking free of your family's dysfunction, or for those of you who don't see the dysfunction clearly, just your family's patterns. Breaking free from your family's patterns or your family's dysfunction causes a great deal of guilt. I was just talking to my wife last night about something she was feeling confused and not too good about. And I said, of course, when we grow, we don't feel good at first. We feel the opposite. We feel bad. It feels wrong. So your work is getting to that and seeing that. Your work is seeing that you have mental health issues to work on. You have mental illness issues to work on. The work is to be able to look at your childhood and your parents. This is critically important. It's what we're helping your children do. To look at your parents and the other big people that were around when you were growing up, to look at them critically. I don't mean the word critical, I don't mean it in terms of negative. I mean it like a critic. To see their strengths, to see their weaknesses. And there are plenty of both. But most of it is unconscious. Most of it's just assumed. It's that idea that the fish is the last to discover water. I refer to our childhood and what happened to us as the air that we breathe, the soup that we were cooked in. So you have to find the soup. The way you find the soup, the way you find the air, the way you find the water is you have to know not soup. You have to know not air. You have to know not water. Because if everything is water, you don't know what water is. So that you find this psychotherapy serves you in this way because you sit with a therapist who ideally is fundamentally different than your parents. What was bad or horrible or terrifying or disgusting at home is now in the therapy session nothing. What was anxiety producing or repulsive or unacceptable is now met with compassion and empathy. So your work is to realize that what you learned, some of it was great. You have a lot of talents, you have a lot of gifts, and your parents have contributed to those also. But those aren't the things that are going to set you back. Those aren't the things that are going to cause you consternation and challenge you in your life. It's finding out how you were dented, finding out what you don't know, finding out about the water that you were swimming in. And then you become more of an agent, more choiceful. And remember this, mom and dad, or anybody listening, getting healthier will feel bad. Or I should say, behaving in behaving in healthy ways. Behaving in healthier ways will initially feel bad. You will feel guilt. You'll feel shame. You'll feel lost. You'll feel off track. So that's the work. And I'll spend an hour talking about it at the end of the month on that broadcast. Somebody writes, my son is 4 months out of Evoke and has recently had some setbacks. We have found us going back to some of our wilderness strategies. What are some tips that you suggest for this point of post-wilderness? Would you look up for me, Sarah, and post it for the live audience? The 8 tools blog that I did, and maybe even the 8 tools broadcast that I did, if you can find that. Post those two. The 8 tools came out of a presentation I was giving in Seattle, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. Somebody asked me to share with the group the tools and the skills. You might know I'm not a tool and skill guy. You know, most of what I talk about is a deeper transformation. The tools can assist, but the tools are shallow or superficial if that's all we're doing. But I also know that tools, when practiced regularly, can change you, can change the way that you think, can change the way that you feel. I remember one father and mother, but the father specifically, after having read these 8 tools, was trying to write a letter to his son. Not a tough letter, just a weekly letter. And he was trying, for example, not to use the word should or shouldn't, which is one of the tools. And as he talked about how he might share some news from home about his brother, the child's uncle, he stopped and started half a dozen times. And he said to me, "It's so hard. I don't even know what to say or how to talk anymore." And my response is, "That's good. That's a really, really good sign." Getting lost, having the what you knew fade away, having the carpet pulled out, the rug pulled out from underneath you, being turned upside down. These are all really, really good things in psychotherapy. And my response was keep going. And what using these skills, these tools will compel you to do is to find a new way to think about what you're trying to communicate. So the 8 tools came out of that. And part of them came out of the research in our field of what parents and families say who find success. So using feeling statements. Now it's not the formal feeling statement, but it's talking about feelings. It's deep listening is the tool number 2. It's avoiding imperatives like should, ought to, must, need to. It's avoiding all or nothing language. One of the tools that families identified as key for them. It's taking time outs. It's practicing self-compassion. When you're communicating, one of the other tools is be clear about what your intention is underneath what you're saying. State it ahead of time if you can, or ask the person who's talking to you ahead of time. So the tools are like a funnel. In and of themselves, they're just words. They can be faked or mimicked. But practice more regularly. The 8 tools, and I came up with 12 initially, but my wife told me that nobody listens to 12. You have to get down to around 8. So I smashed a couple of them together. The 8 tools are the best way that I know to kind of funnel yourself back, but doing your work, coming to a parent intensive. You know, the number, the amount of money that I have spent myself on therapy for myself, my wife, my 4 children, who I do not require to go to therapy, have not required to go to therapy for years and years, for a decade. For intensives that I've gone to, intensives that my wife and I has gone to, that she's gone to alone, intensives that my 2 older children have gone to by their choice. The amount of money have spent over the years, well over $100,000, well over $100,000. The reason I bring that up, because you don't really care how much money I've spent, is yes, I do sell intensives, but I sell them because I believe in them. I believe that it's the best thing that you can do. I read the quote again by the novelist Anne Lamott today. I saw it on my social media. The best thing you can do to contribute to your child's healing is doing your own work, which means going to your own therapy, going to your own intensive. If you don't want to go to ours, I'm going to name our competitors or others that do it. Go to Onsite outside of Nashville, Tennessee. I went to that one. Go to the Survivors Program at the Meadows. I went to that one. Go to the House of Ocala. Judy Crane runs that, owns that. I went to she conducted one of my wife and I's couples intensives. Go to intensives. Go to the Renaissance at the Caron Foundation. Bridge to Recovery. Those are all the others that come off the top of my head. Go to theirs. Go somewhere. I happen to be preferential towards ours. Ours happens to be, in my opinion, more clinical than all of those. The only one that proposes to be based on attachment theory, but I haven't gone to one of ours. I've led many of them, of course, but I've gone to programs at other places, and so have my children and my wife. Go somewhere. Go to Al-Anon. Go to Codependence Anonymous. Go to Families Anonymous. It's one of the closing slides each time. It's not a quick fix. It's not a one-time discussion. It's a engagement. These intensives and these support groups are engaging in a practice and a discipline Daniel Siegel, perhaps the most renowned psychiatrist in the United States, says very, very clearly and succinctly, the greatest predictor of a child's well-being is the self-awareness of the parent. And I'm not talking about how intelligent you are. And I'm not even talking about how clinically adept you are. I'm talking about how much you know of your own dents and bruises and contributions to the cycles, to the problems. That's the heroic journey. That's what the journey of the heroic parent means. It means taking the inward journey and looking at yourself. I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? That's heroic. Because that's saying you are part of the problem. You might not be the origin of all of it. There are other circumstances there's another parent or two or three besides you. There's teachers, there's peers, there's organic differences you have nothing to do with in terms of your choice, in terms of the child's brain. But all of those things that you can't control, you can't control. So focus on the one thing that you can, which is your work. It will change you. And when you find the awareness, you will see it everywhere. You will see it everywhere. You'll hear it in movies. I'm sure many of you watched the Academy Awards last night. And I don't usually watch the whole thing. My wife is a huge fan of it, but I sat down and watched the entire Academy Awards, every second of it. And the day before, I watched everything, everywhere, all at once for the second time. The first time I liked it, but I was overstimulated. It was too much. It was too different than other movies that I'd seen, and I got lost in the literal storyline. But I watched it again, and it's about psychotherapy, and it's about generational transmission of pathology, and it's about choosing surrender over anger. It's the same message as Star Wars. It's the same message as The Matrix, of course. It's in part based on The Matrix or references The Matrix. It's about realizing that we have to wake up to who we are, and that takes courage and work, and it's terrifying, and most people don't do it. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's what I believe. And also, by the way, you're welcome to come to Finding You. In fact, we have a spot left. I think we did as of this morning. There were a couple of people that were vying for it, but we had a spot left this morning for our March 22nd, and we have one every month, and I'll announce those at the end of the broadcast again. All right, another long question has two parts to it. Number one, I've been listening to your podcast for several months now. The one on couples was particularly meaningful to me. Our child went away to a wilderness program a few years ago at age 14, and when he returned, he was in a much better place. It was at that point that I realized that many of the struggles we were having as a family stemmed by the strained relationship between me and my husband. Fast forward 2.5 years. Our child is no longer in therapy, but I am, and so is my husband. We do our own work. I'm struggling to figure out whether or not I want to stay in the marriage long term right now. I'm not going anywhere as I do not want to derail the progress our child has made over the last few years. On your podcast, you talk about how it is not your partner's job to make you happy. I said that to my husband after listening to you say that, and he said he did not know what that meant. I thought about it a little more, and I'm wondering if you could expand on the statement as it relates to a relationship and a marriage. If there are certain aspects of our relationship that do not work for me, how can I articulate this to my husband in ways that stands by your mantra that it is my job to make myself happy without asking him to fix something? I'm so glad that you asked this question because you're not the only one that's going to have it. You know, people talk about in marriage that you need to communicate. Of course you do. And you'll hear suggestions from therapists. You'll hear them from me about sharing your feelings and sharing your needs. You'll have a lot more suggestions from me about listening and truly containing the needs and the expression of your partner. But ultimately, just because you tell your partner what you feel and what you need, it doesn't mean that they're going to change and that they are obligated to change. I'll take it to a level of absurdity just to illustrate. You might say to your partner, I feel the need to slap you every time I'm frustrated. And obviously the partner, if they're in a healthy place, is going to say that's not okay. Right? If they're practicing self-care, unless they enjoy being slapped, which we won't get into that tonight, but we're just talking mainstream thought now. Um, the thought is, well, I can't do that. You can say to your husband or to your wife, I don't want you to travel for work. It might be core to their needs. You can say to them, I want you to bring me flowers. The spouse gets to decide if they listen, after they listen to how you feel, if they can give what you're needing, what you're asking, meet that need without it taking away a core piece of what they need. And they get to decide if it's too much. I don't get to decide. You don't get to decide. Their family doesn't get to decide. Your family doesn't get to decide. Any psychotherapist in the world doesn't get to decide. Esther Perel doesn't get to decide, right? They get to decide. But at the end of the day, what I'm saying is you're fundamentally responsible for your own serenity and your own happiness. And if you can't have what you need, instead of bullying, complaining, pleading, begging, guilting, shaming, nagging, the list can go on. Those are as many verbs as I want to use right now. Instead of doing that, you have to go somewhere else, right? Sometimes when people are in a conflictual marriage and on the verge of considering divorce, one of the questions that I ask is, if you stay with your partner, are you going to continue to treat them poorly because they're not meeting your needs? Because that's not good for you, and that's not good for them. To be cruel to somebody, to be critical of somebody, to be unkind, to be to accuse them, to nag, to beat them up, to belabor the point, to debate. So yes, we share with each other, and in marriage, it's a compromise, right? You have to submit, you have to yield, you have to work together. But each of you get to decide if it's enough. In the book, The Audacity to Be You, I share the story about a husband and wife where the husband decided to tell the wife, I want you to see if you can even get happy. Because he didn't say this in the video that I quoted, but what I'm sure happened is what happens in a lot of marriages is his wife was telling him on a pretty regular basis how he was doing things that were making her unhappy. And so his response, in fact, their mutual agreement was, go find happiness. Go see if you can even discover it for yourself. And then the job is to come to the marriage happy, not to come to your spouse begging for them to fill your empty cup. That's what I mean by that. Yes, there's compromise. Yes, we can ask. Yes, I try to attend to my wife's needs when I can, when I have the energy, the capacity, when it doesn't take away something core for myself. And if you ask me how much is too much to give, because the question comes up pretty regularly in these contexts, this kind of question. You don't want to be a doormat, but you don't want to be too rigid and demanding either. So how much is too much of a doormat, too sacrificing, too self-effacing, too self-sacrificing, and how much is too demanding? My answer is, you get to decide. But you want to know the secret? Most of us aren't willing to just decide on our own, because going back to the question about what's our work, we need someone else to tell us it's okay. And a good person to do that is a psychotherapist. But even they don't really get to decide. You get to decide. That's the work of becoming yourself. That's the work of being you. That's the work. That's why we call our program for individuals, our intensive programs, that's why we call them Finding You. And I will promise you this, in many cases, if not most, when you take a step toward health, I've said that already once today in a different way. I've said it the last couple of times. When you take a step toward health, the people around you will think that you're crazy. They'll think that you've lost your marbles, that you've gone wayward, that you've turned into a selfish monster. But the fact of the matter is, you can't wait for everybody to celebrate you. And healthy steps will look unhealthy to most people. I get people saying, well, is my spouse setting a healthy boundary or are they being selfish? And my response is, they get to figure that out. You don't get to decide. But in relationships, and they teach you this in recovery from codependency, you get to decide, then they get to decide. Then you get to decide, then they get to decide. And I'm not saying this should escalate in a hours conversation to a divorce, but I'm saying you get to decide. If your partner's drinking, you get to decide if you're okay with that. Do you get to decide if they're alcoholic? No. But we want to, because we want to be right. We want someone to give the diagnosis. We want to take out that checklist that they give sometimes to determine whether or not somebody's an alcoholic or an addict, and go down that list and hand it to our spouse who's drinking and say, see, this is proof that you have alcoholism and therefore you are compelled to quit drinking. That's not how it works. The way that it works in recovery, the way that it works in healing, the way that it works as we evolve and become more enlightened is we say, if it rises to that level of too much is too much, we say, I can't do this anymore. I'm not willing to do this anymore. I'm not going, it could be something small, like I'm not willing to spend our family vacation by going to your parents' house. And then you get to decide if that's tolerable or not. So that's what I mean by you're responsible for your happiness. You are fundamentally responsible for your own serenity, for your own peace of mind, for your own well-being. And if you cannot, after good communication or efforts at communication, if you cannot get what you need, not what you like and prefer, but what you need, and you get to decide that, where that line is. If you cannot get what you need in a certain context or situation, it's your job to go get it. Not to abuse the other person or manipulate the other person until they meet all of your needs. That's pure pathology. That's what personality disorders are defined by, is that you have to do it my way. You have to. Somebody writes, what do you think about apologizing to your adult child for sending her to wilderness and a therapeutic school when part of the reason I sent her is because I couldn't live with her because of my own anxiety and fear about her behavior? It's been 9 years and she's been sober 5 years and is an AA, and I'm an Al-Anon. We do have a good relationship now. Am I opening a can of worms? It's a great question. I mean, if you feel sorry about it, apologize for it, first of all. If she's angry, I've said this before. I've sent 2 of my children to treatment at one point when they were younger. My 30-year-old when he was 13 and my 20-year-old when he was 16. So I've sent 2 of my children. And if they came back to me with anger and resentment for sending them away, my response would be, neither one of them did. But if they did, my answer would be, I'm sorry. Thank you for telling me. I wouldn't explain it was the best that I could do. I wouldn't say things I had no other choice. I wouldn't present them the evidence with why my choice was justified. I would just say, I'm sorry. See, mom and dad, you're doing the best you can. And you don't have all the answers. Enlightenment is realizing that. Enlightenment is more about not knowing than it is about being certain. Being certain is death in a spiritual sense. Then there's no growth. There's no option. There's no option to learn or to expand or to grow. Excuse me, got the hiccups. But I will say, if you feel regretful about it, apologize. If she feels angry, you can apologize. That's not saying you did the wrong thing. It's just saying, I tried, and it may have very well been a mistake, and I hear you. Maybe it was wrong. I'm sorry. I want to hear your anger. I want to hear your resentment. I want to hear your grief. And I can accept the fact that it may have been a mistake. So, yes, that's what I would say. Somebody says, I started with this journey when my son went to treatment. It was there I learned that he was not the only one who needed help. It has been almost 4 years, and I can say, with the help of his treatment center, therapy, your books, intensives, webinars, and the podcast, I have made huge progress. I've seen the positive effects of this work and love seeing it reflected back to me and my children. I totally bought into the grandiose idea that maybe one day I would be a set, secure, regulated, and true self. But what I have learned is what I want the most for others to see me is not what I want them to see. I absolutely fear the most. What I want for others, I'm going to read that again. But what I, but what I have learned is that what I want the most, I absolutely fear the most. The battle has been the hardest to overcome, and seeing my young daughter struggle with a lot of the same feelings, I find myself torn on what to do next. Sometimes not being authentic and not being seen feels like the safest place to be, and the loneliest. Where does one go from here? Any thoughts? I mean, you're there. Keep going. That's the work. I wrote the other day in the book that I'm writing that therapy should feel good. Of course, we're going to experience pain and grief. The therapist is going to help us deal with feelings that we've avoided, which are going to be anger, sadness, hurt, pain, insecurity, all of the feelings that we wanted to avoid. But it's also going to feel good too. It's going to feel like you're not alone. The healing comes, this is not my idea. The healing comes not when you realize that you're great, but when you realize that you're an nincompoop, but you're still okay, lovable, worthwhile, worthy, that you deserve to find happiness in this life. If you're going to therapy to learn that you're good, it's you haven't transformed to a new level of consciousness. As the Guru Ram Dass says, one of my favorite quotes, we can't counteract I am bad or I am unlovable with I am good or I am lovable. We have to go beneath those polarities down to I am. So I would just say, keep going. The stuff that you said in your question, you're there. Just keep going. Takes a long time. I think the biggest barrier to psychotherapy is the pace. I think most people want a hack or a shortcut. What I tell people about what I teach therapists, what I wrote in my book to the therapist that I'm writing, it's a book about how to do therapy, is maybe the first sign of successful therapy is the client wants to keep coming back. They want more of it. It felt it at some level rewarding, even if the process asked them to look at it and feel uncomfortable, difficult things that they've been avoiding. So keep going into it. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. My therapist is 35 years older than me. And she would tell you the same thing. You just keep working on it. You keep going deeper. I've said recently, I get to a level of awareness and I think, oh, wow, I've really come to see my nincompoop self. I'm trying to use a word that wouldn't trigger people. My horrible, rotten self is what I call it in the Audacity to Be You. I've found my horrible, rotten self. But then something happens. I read a poem. I see a movie. I read a new quote. I have an interaction with my wife or my children. I have another therapy session with my therapist, and I realize there's another level down. There are stairs leading to an even lower floor. And I get to that next floor, and I think, now I've arrived. I've accepted my horrible, rotten self. And it happens again and again. And after a while, it becomes pure joy, because what that is freedom. It's freedom from the nonsense out there in the world, that we can get right and that we can get it all together, and that the goal is to arrive and to be good and to be right. Essentially, the outcome of psychotherapy, of good psychotherapy, is to stay in contact, to come in contact with your horrible, rotten self, and to stay in contact with it, to learn to love it, to learn to have compassion. It will allow you to say, I'm sorry, more easily. It will allow you to extricate yourself from codependent dynamics of guilt and shame. You'll operate from a place of authenticity, of the real self, not the false self that you had to develop to survive. So you're already there. You're already in it. Just keep going. I just mostly want to congratulate you. And find somebody that can walk with you. That's the second thing. It's important to say that. Don't go alone. You don't have to go alone. Make sure that you have a good therapist that is walking beside you, because you're right. It's scary. As Emma said, my daughter said, it causes a great deal of guilt to extricate myself, pull myself out of my family's unhealthy dynamics. But she said, I go to therapy so somebody can help me carry that guilt. This is my last question for tonight. Someone writes, has Evoke ever done or considered doing a multi-generational parents workshop? Is it appropriate? Wow. I'd have to think about that. We haven't. I guess that's the answer. I've only worked with 2 generations at a time at our workshops, but I'd be open to it. I mean, tomorrow I turn 55. Today is my last day of being 54, so I'm old already. When I see somebody that comes to one of our intensives that's in their 60s or 70s or 80s, I am in awe. I'm in awe of them. When I see a therapist who's been in practice for 20 years and they start to hear some of what we talk about and teach at Evoke with the attachment-based response, the attachment-based model that we teach, where we know that the trigger or the symptom is not in the way and not to be fixed, but the trigger is the way into greater awareness and consciousness. The symptom is the trail of crumbs that you follow. You don't fix it. You follow it back to the original wound and you attend to that. When I see therapists that have been in practice for 20 years who go away from treating symptoms and behaviors and start doing that kind of work, I'm in awe. I think one of the things that we're doing a lot is we're avoiding grieving. And life is a life well spent is a series of deaths. There's a famous quote I think it's by Carl Jung. It might be by somebody else. You could Google it right now. You could Google it, Sarah, and it'd probably tell you. It's probably more than one person that has said this, but the quote goes something like this: that death is the midway point of a well-lived long life. We have to die. We have to let go of our old ideas, old beliefs, even those that we held close, that we clung to. I'll tell you a funny story. I was getting ready this morning and I was looking in my closet. I'm thinking, I gotta clean. There's so many clothes in here that I haven't worn in a long time. I thought to myself, and one of the shirts caught my eye. And I remember that shirt. I thought I wore that shirt when I was at my heaviest. I've had fluctuation with weight over the course of my life, and I thought I wore that shirt at my heaviest. I don't want to get rid of him because he was there for me when I needed him. And I laughed at myself. This happened in all of about 3 seconds. And I laughed and I thought, I'm codependent with shirts. I'm projecting onto shirts, right? Anthropomorphizing shirts, and I'm codependent with them. I'm not wanting to hurt the blue collared shirt that was there for me when I was heavy, that clothed me when I was at my lowest point. That's the kind of stuff we carry around. That's the kind of stuff that we're up against. And we're going to be up against it in one way or another, one measure of another, until we stop breathing. Yes, there will be long strides in our growth process, for sure. I don't think it would be sustainable if there weren't those at times. And yes, some things, some behaviors, some interactions will be in our past. But more often than not, the core themes and dilemma of our life is something that is a life's work. And the great paradox, as Carl Rogers says, is that it's only when we accept ourselves that we can change. So that's what I would invite, is accepting yourself. In terms of the multi-generational land, the reason I got off on that is the multi-generational workshop is we would have to have some grandparents that would be willing to look themselves towards the end of their life. One of the lines, this was in the Letters of Juliet that we used the intensive. It's also in my new book. I've written it. I've talked about it before. It was a realization I had about 5 or 6 years ago when I decided that my mother I was not going to allow my mother to be around my young children anymore, the children that live in my home. When the mother said to her father, in Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, I will not let you abuse my daughter the way that you abused me. And sometimes when we see our parents saying things, doing things to our children, they remind us of our wounding. And we might have been willing to put up with it for ourselves, but there's something in our mama bear, papa bear bodies that says that's enough. That's what woke Darth Vader up from his slumber when he saw the Emperor hurting Luke. And that's one of the realizations that the mother, the protagonist, and Everything, Everywhere, All at Once had. And that's what Juliet in chapter 1 in the Letters of Juliet to the Knight in Rusty Armor hadn't realized yet, that her mother was making her grandchild the problem. So I'm open to it, but it would take a courageous set of at least 2 generations. The child, I don't need them to be courageous because they're at the tail end of this mini process, this generational process. They just got to show up, barely show up. But mom and dad and grandma and grandpa, grandparents, takes a lot of courage. All right. That's not it exactly. I'll post it next time, Sarah. Thanks. All right, folks. To our upcoming events, you can get your cameras ready if you're watching live. Aim your phone camera at the QR code if you want to access the respective web pages. My 2 books, my 2 first books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. I narrated The Audacity to Be You. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, I've been talking about it all night. I've even told you our competitor's name. You can go there. If you want to go to ours, the next available Finding You Intensives is March 22nd. And the one after that is April 19th. You can go to our website. We also have custom intensives for families and couples called Finding Connection and Finding Family. You can email intensives@evoketherapy.com. We have a Returning to You, which is if you've been to a Finding You and you want to come back, October 11th through 15th will be our Returning to You. And then I'm going to be hosting a Finding You weekend in the UK this summer, June 23rd through 25th. It is filling up. So if you're interested, contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. It's at a beautiful location. It's a wonderful experience. And not only do I host it, but I stay with you. So the discussions go on over dinner and in the evening. So I really, really love it. We have support groups for current families and alumni families. So if you are a Wilderness family, alumni, or current, the next available offering is March 16th at 6:30 p.m. Once a month, we have an alumni-only meeting for parents of Wilderness, March 28th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. For our intensives and coaching folks, March 14th at 6 p.m. is our next offering. There's the QR code. You can also contact Sarah D at evoketherapy.com or go to evoketherapy.com/family-involvement for more information. If you want to coach for individual parents, couples, families, we have, as of the day before I left on vacation, 42 of them. I think we're up to 43. We have 43 coaches. They can help you on increasing your self-awareness, as I discussed, insight. They really do understand the attachment-based model. They've been trained in the attachment-based model. Many of them have worked intensives. Many of them have worked in Willer's therapy and in treatment centers. So individual, couples, families, parenting, transitioning back home. And you only, this sounds so simple, but you only pay for what you actually use. We don't sell packages that you may or may not use. You just pay for the session that you have. And a lot of you might be thinking, well, that's normal. There are lots of coaching programs, lots of virtual therapeutic programs over the country where you have to buy packages. And then you're stuck with it if you don't like it or it doesn't serve you or it doesn't work out. These are pay as you go. Our pursuits adventure trips, anywhere from 3 to 30-day programming, contacting intensives at evoketherapy.com. Think therapy light, sober fun, transitioning home, recalibrating and reconnecting to your therapy. Like I mentioned earlier, we ask and invite and strongly encourage everybody listening, especially the parents in our program, to attend 6 of any combination of the following support groups: Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. Also, RefugeRecovery.org is a Buddhist-inspired program, less of an emphasis on a higher power, and the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, NAMI.org, have free classes and resources in your local communities. All these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app or Spotify. Just go there and search Finding You an Evoke Therapy Podcast. You can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer and listen there, or you can watch the rebroadcast of these on Evoke's YouTube channel. You can follow Evoke Therapy Programs or me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter or Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy or at Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can also follow and check out our Evoke Intensives Instagram page using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our blog has wonderful content each month. If you want to give back to people that can't afford therapy, and we're really grateful because some of these have now started to contribute finances to the intensive programming. So it's not just limited to the programming of wilderness. You can earmark them for specific venues, for specific programs, for specific populations if you want to. Our 3 charitable partners that we work with are ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, and EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. So you can go to those websites, contact them, learn more about that. You can either give or ask for help if you need it. My next broadcast will be this week. I'm going back to the twice a week that we've been doing for many, many years, when I can, twice a week. So the next available offering will be this Wednesday, March 15th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. I'm going to be talking about transporting. There's a lot of conversation about transporting in the media right now. A lot of parents are hearing about it. A lot of kids are talking about it. So I'm going to talk about and speak to transporting. To transport or not to transport? That is the question, and that is the title of the broadcast. This Wednesday, March 15th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Have a great evening, folks. Thanks for joining me. For and on behalf of those that love you and that you love, thank you for showing up to these. Thank you for listening and being willing to do your work. It makes a difference. Have a great evening. I'll talk to you in about 48 hours. Take care. Bye-bye.